Hey, what is going on, guys? This is Eli for MOBOX, and this time we're going to set up a 3D chat conversation. So the first part to achieve the chat bubble is creating a sphere object. With the sphere object selected, we are going to change the type from standard to hexahedron. Now you can't see any difference, so let's go up here to display and enable some lines on this. So now we can see we have a perfect topology with only quad polygons. So we have this line right through the middle, but for things to be easier in the long run, we want a polygon at the center of this. So let's change these segments until we get a polygon at the middle. So we have this at 27, but we also get this at 33 segments. So let's stick with that. And we can now make the object editable by pressing C. Now let's go to the front view. So we can use the point mode and the rectangle selection tool to select half of the sphere, like this. And we're just going to move these to the side, something like 200 centimeters, so it's just out of the way. So now we have this capsule shape. It's better than using the actual capsule because now we have a nice topology at the side here. So let's go to a capsule to show exactly what I mean. So here we have the squares, and here you have this very pointy end on the capsule, which is not that nice if you smooth it out. So let's continue with the sphere. We are going to scale this down a bit as an object, so let's go to the scale tool and squeeze it down only on the blue axis, so the Z axis. Let's go for something like 60%, so it's a bit more flat. And now one last part for the chat bubble is the tail at the bottom. So let's make sure we're at the front view to make it clear which side is which. So you can see I was looking at the back. Let's rotate this. I'm going to select a bunch of these, so let's start at this part here. Maybe 5 of them horizontally. And let's go for 3 rows towards the top, like this. So that's about a square. We're going to use the inner extrude tool by pressing I. Make sure the preserve groups option is turned on, so we scale this as one block instead of every single polygon apart. And we're just going to use an offset of 5 centimeters, like this. So now with these new polygons, let's make an extrusion on this. Doesn't really matter how big it is, but I wouldn't go too big. It also goes outwards, so let's use the scale tool to scale this down, like this. I'm also going to rotate this just a bit. And let's use the extrude tool once more to give it that final tail. And we're also going to scale this down. And this is some kind of tail, but it is still very rough. This is why I wanted the clean topology at the side here, because now we can use a subdivision surface and drag the sphere inside of it, and it will smooth this out for us. Okay, so that is the basic bubble. If you didn't deselect the polygons at the side here, that's a good thing. So what we can do is going to mesh, axis center, once more axis center, and in here we can center the object its axis to these selected polygons. So the action is axis 2, center it to the selected polygons and execute. So now if we go to the object mode again, you should see the axis is still centered to the selection. That's a good thing because we want to scale this later on from that start point. Now we want to set up some kind of rig for this, so we can easily adapt the shape of this depending on the text size which it will have to hold. So let's right click on this and go to character tags, and we're going to set up a pose morph tag. In here let's go and enable the points mode for this. That's all we need. And you can already notice we have the base pose and the pose 0, so that's the first adjustable pose. For the base pose we need to adjust this back again, because we want this to be a perfect sphere, so something that is not holding any text. So make sure you have this base pose selected. Also make sure you have the sphere selected. And we're going in the point mode, so we can move these back 200 centimeters, because that's how much we moved them in the first place. Okay, so the base pose is back to normal. Now for pose 0, we're going to adjust this. So let's say this adjustment will be for the width of this. So you can make this whatever size you like. I'm just going with something like 800 centimeters as a maximum value. Now we're also going to add a second pose for the height of this. So add a pose, and let's rename it so we know what's going on. And let's go back in the front mode so we can easily select the top part of the sphere. And we're going to move this up 800 centimeters as well, or anything you like, of course. Okay, so let's check this out if it works. If we go back to the pose morph tag, and we go to the animate mode of this, you can see this is happening. Let's also disable the lines to have a better view. So we have the width and we have the height. So you can notice it is easy to combine both of these and have very specific shapes. So that's the easy part about this. And it is also nice because we can animate these sliders instead of having to animate the points manually. So I want one more pose, which will be for the scaling. So with this, we can just use the object mode and scale this down while holding Shift to 0%. So if that works right, you can see using the slider scales it from the tail at the bottom here. The next thing we need for this bubble is some text inside of it, of course. So let's go to MoGraph and add a MoText. We're going to go in the Object tab and let's set the height to anything you like, of course, but I think for this scale of a project, 100 centimeters height is just fine. Set up the text you want, and we are going to make sure it is still left aligned. You can use any font you like, of course. Now one more thing we want to do is having some depth on this, so it's sinking inside of the balloon, which we can do with a bool object. So let's create this and disable the high quality option, because you will notice it is very glitchy if you have it enabled for this one. Let's drag both of them inside of this and make sure the subdivision surface with the sphere is above the MoText. Of course, you can't see anything right now because it's just inside of there. So let's move this text a bit to the front. And now we need to line this up. So the easiest way to do this is disabling the subdivision surface. Let's go back to the front view. And now you have these lines, of course. So we want to make sure it doesn't go over the other half of the sphere, so the start point. So that's good by default now. Let's also move it down like this. So we have these lines as some kind of grid, of course. And now we are going in the pose morph tag, in the animate settings, so we can scale this exactly like we want it to. So it doesn't need any additional height for this. We just want the width to be different. If it's a bit difficult with all the lines, you can also disable the bool for now. Okay, so this looks right for me. Now we can continue and see how it looks with the bool enabled. Just make sure every letter is pushing inside of it. And you can also notice we have some creasing down here. That's because we have it at the low quality setting instead of the high quality. But if we render this, you can see it is actually gone, so it doesn't really matter that much. And with animations, using the high quality option, it will get glitchy and have some letters disappear at some frames, so we don't want that. A good habit for this one is using some kind of placeholder or frame around this, so I know how far apart the text bubbles should be. So how I do this is just creating a rectangle, and we're going to scale this up, let's say 1200 centimeters on the other side, and just 400 in height, and we're going to line this up with the side of the bubble. Okay, so that's just a framing. It will not be visible in the render, so it's just for our reference. Okay, so maybe it's a good time to start animating some parts of this as a basic setup. So let's go in the pose morph tag, and we have the animate option still enabled, so make sure that's also the case for you. Let's start something at 10 frames or something. And let's say we want this to take 20 frames to complete the animation. So for the scale, we want this to end at 30 frames, at 0% in this case, so it's fully scaled. Click this button to create a keyframe. Then at 10 frames, which is the start of the animation, it should be at 0 scale, so scale it down. And now for the width scale, I want this to also end at 30 frames, so the end of the animation. But it shouldn't take that long, so we have a bit of delay at the beginning. So let's say we started half of the animation, so at 20 frames, at 0%. So you can see it starts as a nice sphere, and then it extends to the side. But you can see it intersects with the text, and it doesn't look that good this way. So what we can do for this is adding some plane effectors. So let's go to MoGraph, Effector, and add the plane effector. In here, we are going to the parameter tab, and you can already disable the position and scale and rotation. Anything of that has to be disabled. We just want this to affect the visibility of the letters. So go down here and check the visibility option. But now it doesn't do anything just yet because we need some kind of fall off to this. I'm in Cinema for the R20, so we have the fields option now. But if you're in an older version, you should see just a fall off tab where you can also select some kind of linear and box shapes. So in this case, we also just want the linear field. So we have it set to linear, but it isn't affecting the text just yet because we need to link it together. So let's go to mode text. And in here we can select how it is being affected. So we can affect all of it, just the lines of text, the words or the letters. So if you have a full paragraph of text, you may want to set it up on words instead of letters. But for this small text, we want to set it up at letters. So open that tab and drag in the plane effector. I'm also going to rename this. So this is visibility. I'm also going to the fall off tab for this. And let's change the field size of this to something like 20 centimeters. So it isn't as big. And let's see if this is working. Okay, so you can see it works if we move this. But it is going the other way around, so we don't want it to go hidden, we want it to go visible. So the easiest way to fix that is just rotating the plane effector. So now we can also animate this. So let's start at the side here at 10 frames. And you're going to end at the same time as the other animation. But it has a bit of spill right here, so it will be faster. New keyframe. You can also disable the bool to have a faster operating viewport. So you can see that's way too fast, so we need to adjust the keyframes for this. Let's say we have maybe 20 frames delay. Let's see how that works. That's too much, so 10 frames. I think that's right. If you want to, you can also add a secondary plane effector to this. So let's just duplicate this one. And we're not going to affect the visibility again, we're just going to affect the scaling this time. So back in the parameter tab, we need to disable the visibility and enable the scale. Let's make it go for a uniform scale, so the whole thing as its own. And let's set the scale to -1, so it starts at no size and it will go to the normal size once the effector is being moved over it. Let's also go back to the fall off tab and maybe we can increase the size of this one, so it covers a bit more letters at once. And one more thing we need to make sure is that the mode text is being affected by this. So let's drag this in. And you can also notice it is just focusing on what's inside of the fall off, but we want it the other way around. So let's go to linear field, for this one of course, and go to remapping and invert this. And again, if you're on an older version, you should have an invert option just at the fall off settings as well. Okay, so that looks nice now. Now one more thing I would like to have for this animation is something that makes it a bit bouncy. It's very linear right now. It is not that straightforward for this one because we have a deep hierarchy already. So what we can do is using the jiggle deformer for this. It needs to be set up close to the sphere, but if we would group this all together, it will not be affected by it. It needs to be more specific. In fact, it needs to be exactly right next to the sphere. Or under it in this case. Even if we do that, it will not work. And that's because we need to connect both of these. So we can do that with the connect object. So here it gets a bit more specific for this to work. So we need to make sure the connect object is also inside of the subdivision surface. And we have the sphere and the jiggle inside of the connect object, so it connects both of these. So let's try the animation once again. Okay, so that works, but the jiggle is still not set up like we wanted to. So let's go in the jiggle options, in the object tab, and we're going to increase the stiffness of this so it isn't as soft. And we're also going to increase the drag of this a bit more, something like 20%. And one more thing we can do to make this less soft is decreasing the structural from 100% to 0%. Okay, so that looks nice. One more thing I would like to do before moving on is setting up some animation for the jiggle enable and disable. Because if we have this enabled and we would move this around, it still jiggles on that animation. And we don't want it to do that because the text is not jiggling together with the rest. So let's make sure we are at the end of the animation. So that was at 30 frames. So let's add a bit of tail to this animation. So for example, 40 frames. And in here, let's select the jiggle deformer, go to basic, and you're going to set up a keyframe for enabled. Then go one frame further, disable it, and set up a keyframe again. So now it only affects this part of the animation and not anything that's behind it. Okay, so this is the basic setup for one bubble. So let's call this bubble left. Now it's very easy to make a second one for this. So let's just hit copy and paste. Let's also rename it straight away. And we're going to set this up differently. I'm going to hide the original one. So for this one we want it to be at the other side. That's quite easy to do. Just select the sphere inside of this. And we're going to rotate this 180 degrees. And just move it to the other side. But also the text needs to be moved to this part. So first we need to know what the text will be. Again, we can disable the subdivision surface and go to the front view to line this up. And now we need to make sure we have the last keyframe enabled. Also make sure you have the jiggle option disabled, because otherwise it's stretching all over the place. So with this pose morph tag and the last keyframe selected, we can adjust the width of this. Let's also disable the bool and the fields for this, so we can see everything that's going on. And I think 56 frames is just right for me. And keyframe again, so it overrides the original one. So let's enable all of this back again, like so, and see if this works. Okay, that works. Maybe you can adjust the scaling and visibility fall off for this. Make sure when you're selecting this that the pose morph tag is not still selected, because otherwise you're also moving these keyframes. So disable that. So that's too early. Okay, so that looks fine for now. But of course, these are happening at the same time now. So what we can do to put some delay on this is right-clicking on this bubble right group and select all the children. But also make sure you have the pose morph tag selected. So also click on that while holding Command or Control, so it's also selected. And now we can select all these keyframes at the bottom and move these to every point we wanted to. So let's extend the timeline a bit. And we will go with frame 60 to start the animation, for example. So now one last thing we need to do to have this happen at the same time is making sure they are not intersecting. So the start of the animation has this one. And then when the other one is starting at frame 60, we want the original one to move up. So keyframe at the beginning here, 20 frames, and then move it up. And keyframe again. So let's see how this looks. Okay, so it's a bit stuttery because of the bool objects, but I'm just going to keep it this way, because we are moving on anyway. The animation part of this is done. Let's set this up with some basic parts. First of all, we are going to add a background to this. It's not something you need to have, but just to follow along with the tutorial and the lighting, it's a nice thing to have. We're going to move this just behind the balloons instead of inside of it. We're also going to set up a basic camera for this. Let's go with a focal length of 200mm or something, so a very zoomed in shot. And I'm going to reset all the values down here to 0, so it starts at the center of the scene. Let's move it back something like 12,000 centimeters. I know that's a lot, but we're also using a zoom lens, so that's why. And we can frame this to the center of the viewport. You can also use a grid for this and enable some more cells, so it is easier to line this up. So this looks about right. Now we can continue with the materials. So let's create a new one. And in here you can use anything you like, of course, but I'm just going to show what I've been using. So for the first white bubble I used some kind of white, of course, with a hint of blue in it, just very slightly. It is just to avoid using pure white. What I also did is going in the reflectance channel. And for the specular options, we can keep most at default. Let's just make this a bit more wide. So 50% for example. So it covers a bit more of the surface. Also the strength doesn't need to be that strong, so we can make that just 10%. Now also one more thing you can do is changing the specular color. So we want this to be more in the blue theme. If you're using totally different colors, you should also think in that direction. So if you're using all red colors, you should stay in the red zone for this. But for now, let's go with the blue one. In this case, this can be quite dark actually. So that's some kind of soft blue-gray. Okay, so now one more thing we want to do in this reflectance channel is adding a becnel layer. We're already going to decrease the strength of this to 90%. We are also going to change some of these values. So let's go with 20% roughness. And all the rest can stay at the same values. But we're going down here with layer Fresnel again and change the Fresnel to dielectric. So that's a totally different look. And all the rest should be fine by default. Okay, let's apply this to the bubble. And we're also going to create a second one, so a duplicate of this. But we're just going to change the color of this one. So to stay close on what we usually have on chat balloons is the blue color. So let's use that. We're also going to create a new material for the text inside of it. So that's a dark gray with a hint of blue in it again. For this one, it's easier to drag this on the object in the hierarchy instead of directly on the object. So because it's so deeply nested. But we don't want it on this one at the bottom. So we are just going to use the white one for the secondary one. Because dark gray wouldn't look that nice on blue. Okay, so now we also just use a material for the background, which will be almost pure white. Just drag it on there. And that should be it for the materials. So let's see how this looks if we render this. Doesn't look that spectacular just yet. It's a bit plain and the shadows are not that good looking. So we're going to add a bunch of lights to this. It's nothing specific again. You will have to play around with the positioning of these because it's very specific how it looks, but it is a bit of trial and error. Okay, so a first light we can add is a top light. So let's create an area light and we're going to rotate this. And let's also try to center this to the bubbles. I'm also going to move this up a bit. And now we also want this to be bigger. I'm going to show you the detail step of the light here so you can see the exact size. I am going with something like 1300 by 800 centimeters for this. So that's roughly the size of the framing actually, but a bit bigger in the depth. Okay, so now we need to adjust the general settings of this. So the intensity doesn't need to be that big, so 70% will do. We are also going to make this a bit softer in the brightness or the color. So it doesn't need to be pure white. Let's use some kind of very soft gray. We're also going to set up some shadows on this, which will be a soft shadow. And in the shadow options here, you can also change the color of this. So black is a bit boring, doesn't look that good. So we're going to make this a mix of dark blue and gray. And I think that's the basic setup for this. So let's go in the camera view and render to see how this looks. So you can see we have some shadows and a nice hit at the top, but it is still way too dark. That's because we will be adding some more lights, of course. So let's go ahead and make a duplicate of this light towards the bottom of this scene. Let's move it down a bit more than the top one, so it has a bit of distance. And we're also going to scale this down a bit. Let's say half of the frame. This one doesn't need the shadows, so let's disable that. But it is going to use some color. Kind of the same color as we have been using for the shadows actually, but even darker. But because it's so dark, we will not see anything of it when it is set at 70%. So let's make this even something like 400%. Let's take a look if this looks right. Maybe we can decrease this a bit more to something like 300%, just to be sure. Okay, so that's not as blown out. But we still have this front which is very dark. So the last part we need for the basic lighting setup is a front light, of course. So let's create a new area light. Let's go outside of the camera view again. And we're also going to move this one back quite a lot. Let's say something like 3000 centimeters. Let's also move this up a bit so the shadow is going downwards just a bit. And we're also going to make this one quite large. Let's say something like 3000 centimeters on every side. So you can see that down here. Let's also go to the General tab again. And we're going to change the intensity to something like 85% or something close to that. It can stay white. And we're also going to set up a soft shadow, where we are also going to adjust the color of the shadow again. Let's take one more look when rendering this. Okay, so that looks a lot better right now, but it is still a bit dark on the edges and stuff, and we don't exactly want that. So one more thing we can do is adding an ambient light to this. So that's just the regular light. Go in the general options and just enable ambient illumination. Let's also decrease the intensity of this because this will make it very bright. So let's go with something like 60%, like this. So that's nice and bright. And now one more thing I personally like to do is adding an environment object. And let's use something like 50% on this. But we're also going to make this color not pure white, but just a bit softer. So also in the blue region again, with just a very bit of saturation. Maybe we can also make this just a bit darker as well. Like this, so you can play around with that. Maybe you don't need it, so you can just disable it if you don't like it. Sometimes it's too bright, sometimes it's too dark. So we have all the parts now to play around with these settings. Okay, so that's basically all there is to setting up this rig. You can use the camera to move around and have some different kind of perspectives, so you can actually see it's 3D. You can also put this in some kind of environment and have it move around in that. I think there are many possible applications for this kind of setup. So if you just want to download and use this setup, you can find that on the Patreon page. If you've made something yourself with this, you can show us on Instagram or Twitter. And with that being said, I hope you learned something new today, and I will see you in the next video.